Rich, are you someone who has dreams at night? Like, do you frequently have dreams when you're sleeping?
Occasionally. Sometimes I try to force it. I try to think of something and then manifest a dream about it, but it never works. I've even looked into like journaling, like waking up and then writing it down. But yeah, ultimately my dreams tend to escape me. What about you?
I'm a dreamer. I have dreams basically every single night. And last night I had a nightmare. Last night I dreamt that I drafted Ramondre Stevenson at ADP.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro.
Welcome into episode number 3 of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, joined as usual by my co-host Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
As always, man, I'm great. I have a Vegas trip coming up this weekend, my annual pilgrimage to the World Series of Poker. So I'm doing all the dad stuff. I had to pick up my mother-in-law from the airport this morning. I got to get the car service today. So a lot of dad stuff to get out of the way to get me ready and primed to head out to the desert this weekend.
Yeah, are you playing some poker out there?
Yeah, so I'm playing one of the opening events. It's called the Mystery Millions. It's a $1,000 buy-in, and it's a really fun event. So it's a bounty tournament, and people might be familiar with bounties where you knock somebody out, and then you get a static prize, essentially, for knocking them out. The most popular in a lot of casinos is called a black chip bounty because the black chip's worth $100. So you get $100 if you knock somebody out. But in this tournament, they take $300 from everybody's entry, they put it into a bounty pool, and then starting on the second day, so there'll be probably 1,000 players remaining, when you knock somebody out, you get a random bounty. And the bounty could be as little as $1,000 or as much as $1 million. So it incentivizes you to be super aggressive, build up a lot of chips, and then be in the position to knock out as many people as possible on day 2.
So when people say that they're going to play poker, I'm like, I play poker, or I did, like, you know, like casually, like I understand poker, but is it just a default that you're playing Texas Hold'em? Is that what's happening at this point? Is that how people in the poker space talk about poker?
I would say so. There's obviously other games, Omaha variants, 7-card stud variants, but they make up a smaller percentage of the tournament schedule for the World Series of Poker, which is actually more inclusive of those events because they want to put on a big product for even the mixed games. But if you go to your local casino and you look to play poker, it's going to be 95+% Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I remember the Texas Hold'em wave that hit when you and I were like in high school-ish, like in middle school to high school. Like it was, at least from my perspective, it was a wave.
I was going to bring this up at some point. You seem like such the ideal person to have been caught in this wave because the people that I've interacted with, especially in the DFS world, are people that transitioned from poker to DFS and then are probably now into best ball. So I was wondering, what was the poker experience like for JJ in high school?
My friends, if any of them listening to this right now, are probably laughing hard because we would play poker basically every weekend, but the way that I approached that kind of thing was just so insanely conservative that I ended up just not really playing that much. I didn't really get into. I knew poker. I watched them play. I'd hang out. I'd play a little bit too at times. But then I didn't really get into it until like more into adulthood. And then by that point, it's not as like accessible as like, yeah, I'm going to my buddy's house this weekend. You know, you have responsibilities and such as a father, as a spouse, as opposed to in high school. What else are you doing? I mean, you have 2 priorities. You're playing System Link Halo, or you're playing some poker. And so, but it's funny. I'm going to bring this up on the show because I hope that one of my high school buddies is listening to this. The last time we all played together, I won. And I credit it to the way my brain now thinks about, like, I've always been good at math and stuff and probability and statistics, but I didn't apply it nearly as much as I do in my everyday life now, obviously with what I do for a living with fantasy football. But I do think that helped a lot in my thinking of, like, you know, that little game that we played at a bachelor party. But yeah, guys, I won the last time we played. Just remember that. Don't forget.
It's so funny that you bring up, you know, playing Halo and LAN parties and stuff like that. The most hands of poker that I played in my entire life were high school and college, where I knew absolutely nothing about what I was doing, statistics, probabilities, things that I should be doing. And now when I've gained so much more knowledge, like you and you're stating now, I have so many more responsibilities. I have so many more daily activities to attend to that I just can't play as much. So it's the youth, as they say, is wasted on the young.
That is very true. And now instead I use my spare time to do massive amounts of slow drafts over on Underdog. That is where my free time goes these days. Speaking of some tournaments, the Pomeranian. We had that over this past week. It's $3 50 entry max tourney that Underdog offered. And I'm a best ball bro now, so naturally I max entered. That thing filled way faster than I thought it was going to fill.
Yeah, you blinked and that thing, because I've been watching. All right, I'm almost there. I'm almost gonna fire up some drafts. I got to get this poker weekend out of the way, but I'm definitely starting to itch. Last week's conversation with Pat really, I mean, that really, there were so many meta concepts, and being uncomfortable is so important when it comes to something like week 17 game stacking, because it's so easy to target those big projected totals. But just like Pat said, like, any of these games can go over the total. So if you find yourself taking players that you believe in early in the draft and you have a natural chance to game stack them week 17, you know, that's the natural fit. And you just have to be okay being uncomfortable taking something like the Panthers or the Patriots, these teams that everybody is going to spend the entire summer dumping on and saying that they can't score. They're not going to be able to do it. Like, you just have to be okay being uncomfortable. And I'm ready. Yeah. I'm ready to be uncomfortable.
I really think that's so key with all of this. Like, I talked to Hayden Winks is the guest that you guys are going to listen to in a second. And there's one specific piece that he talked about that made me feel uncomfortable. But when you listen to it, you'll realize that really does make a lot of sense. It has to do with the tight end position. So you guys can focus in on that whenever you get there. But yeah, look, I talked about it last week. I'm doing way more slow drafts than fast drafts at this point, because fast drafts are just difficult given the schedule, being a dad, waking up in the morning and, immediately having to get the kids ready to go to school and all that kind of stuff. But right now, so after I max entered the Pomeranian, you have the Pomeranian, the Chihuahua, the puppy, and then BBM. I'm now at 92 slow drafts. I was over 100 whenever the Pomeranian was maxed out. And look, I think that I will say, a lot of people will, especially like casuals who don't even know what Underdog is, like friends of mine, right, that I see just hanging out over the weekend. They can't comprehend how you can possibly manage, 100 slow drafts. And I have to tell you, it's pretty manageable. Like, it's not nearly as rough as you think it might be, because you can make a large number of picks all at once and not necessarily have to, worry about just constantly picking. And then whenever you're just like hanging out, at night, whenever you're really tired, kids are in bed, you can make even more picks. So it's really not as difficult to manage as I thought it was going to be. It's not. I'll say this. I've done, in the past, I'd say this time of year, I'd be in like 20 slow drafts, right? Instead of the 92 that I'm in. And I don't see it as that different from that, if that makes sense. Because if I'm going to be on the app, if I'm going to be drafting, might as well just do a few more whenever I'm making those selections. So it's really not as hard to manage. This is the one piece of becoming a best ball bro that I think might be the easiest piece, is the management part. The other stuff, I talked to Hayden, and immediately afterwards, I'm like, I gotta draft a BBM team. And so I immediately just did a fast draft for Best Ball Mania, because I needed to like take some of the stuff we talked about, apply it. I didn't totally apply it the way that I wanted to, because I kept getting sniped at the turn. My team was okay enough. If you guys want to see it, it's over on the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord. Team is okay enough, but not, it wasn't like I walked away. I also want to know if like when people are drafting like this and doing a lot of playing in a lot of leagues and max entering these tournaments, if they walk away from every draft feeling good, you know?
Oh, you can't when you have such a large portfolio. There's going to be some times where, yeah, you're drafting with people that take players that you're intending to take. There's a ton of variance even within drafts where you can't walk away from every draft that you do loving it.
Yeah, that's good. I mentally need to get over that because there are things in fantasy football that I'm a perfectionist with, and that's one of the things. I want to feel strong and good about all these teams, but there are some teams I open it up and I just don't even want to make a pick because the team's horrible, right? Like it's just complete dead money. What was I thinking when this was all going down? How is this the player pool that I'm staring at? It's rough. And then there's some teams where like they look dead mid draft, and if you can resurrect it, like I think that's sort of what the Best Ball Mania team I drafted earlier today, that's over on Discord, it's kind of dead the first like it wasn't really well constructed the first like 6 or 7 rounds, but I think I found a way to kind of maneuver things and make it look at least competitive in some way.
And late round Discord community members will also have access to JJ's rankings, which you can upload a CSV directly to Underdog, which is obviously going to be a huge help. Instead of toggling back from the app to rankings and back and forth, you can get your rankings straight in there. Again, I'm allowed to shill it, JJ, because I'm a paid member.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything. It's a lot better for you to do it and get people excited that way. But yeah, I mean, look, I think talking to these analysts and these people who have been in this game for a while has been really helpful to sort of change my focus around and think about things differently. Like I think last week with Karain, his stance on not picking up values if they don't fit your team build was really, really key. I needed to hear that because when you're doing a lot of drafts, you naturally are like, oh, I got to gobble up ADP value whenever it falls. And sometimes you just can't. Sometimes you have Travis Kelce and Kyle Pitts falls too far. And it's like, I don't really want to go with these 2 elite tight ends or 2 top end tight ends because that's not going to fit my build very well. So, I'm trying to not be overly tied to ADP from that perspective. But also I'm not trying to be overly tied to ADP in general, despite being in so many drafts. I think, again, it's easy to play this value game, but like when you're in the early rounds, it's tougher to have a unique build when you're only drafting off of ADP. That's something that Hayden talks about later in the show too, is that whenever you are in round 1 and round 2, if you're in the 11 spot and AJ Brown is there every single time, or Garrett Wilson, whoever, one of those 2 wide receivers, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. / Drake London is always the second pick with someone in that spot, that means it's just, there's just a lot of that duplication happening and you want to differentiate in some way. So I'm trying my best. It's really hard for me as like more like I try to use a lot of logic with my analysis. I try to be pretty processed. It's really hard for me to be like, you know what, here at the 2-3 turn, maybe at pick 14 or 15, I'm going to reach a little bit and get Deebo Samuel or someone that usually goes in the late second. I'm not doing it like overly frequently, but I am testing it out a little bit because I do think it's important. It's an easy way to differentiate. Yeah,
for sure. We heard Dustin talk about it on perspectives as well. Maybe you don't have to be as insane as taking 100% Jefferson at third overall. You don't have to be that strong-willed when it comes to something like that. But yeah, deviating from chalk is also going to help you when you get to that 500 person field in week 17 as well, because you're not going to have as many duplicate players as some of your competitors. Perhaps some of your stacks might be have some difference there to make them unique in the event that they go off, instead of splitting hairs when it comes down to a couple points. You're going to have a massive advantage because you're going to have a more unique stack compared to your competitors.
Yeah, I think the one place that I'm getting a little bit caught up with the whole ADP differentiation thing in the early rounds is I do wonder, I think that it's better to do that in tournaments that have a very short lifespan in terms of just, like things that fill quickly, right? Like we had the Pomeranian, for instance, like, that contest is going to fill within a week, right? And so ADP is not going to change that dramatically throughout that week. So if you do differentiate from ADP for that contest, that's probably smart because you are getting different builds than what the rest of the pool is doing and rest of the field is doing. Whereas with Best Ball Mania, we're only, 10 to 15% through. And so by the time August hits, Deebo Samuel might be an early second round pick by the time August hits. And if that's the case, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but, Deebo might even be traded. But, if that's the case, then all of a sudden what you thought you were differentiating back then, back in May and into June, really isn't that much of a differentiation because that's how people are just currently drafting, right? In August and in July. And so I do think that I've done that a little bit more with the other contests as opposed to Best Ball Mania. Best Ball Mania, I am being a little bit stricter with that ADP just because it's spanning. And maybe this is wrong. Maybe you think, I don't know, but because it's spanning so many months, feels like the proper game theory thing to do is to not necessarily stray away from ADP as much in the early rounds, but I'm definitely trying to find, I think I've said this for weeks and weeks and weeks. Like, I think Dontavian Wicks is a huge value, right? In general. So, I'm just going to gobble him up now in hopes that his ADP does rise where it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get him. I'm trying to do that with players for sure. There's some that we can get to in a second. But with the early round guys, how much is that really going to change in terms of like, this guy's such a massive value in the second round versus them just shifting sort of in the second round because that second round is so flat right now.
Yeah, outside of injury, how violent of a change can you get in value for some of those players that the market is already deeming to have such value? Wicks, by the way, up another 7.7 spots in drafts. He's up a full round since we started potting. I think you make a great point, though, there about the length of BBM and just how naturally ADP is going to change throughout the summer. I mean, just look this last week, the drumbeat for JMO when you get the coaching staff out there saying he's clearly the WR2. No one's progressed better than him. Like, we're going to get that for so many players throughout the summer, so many injuries. So yeah, the ADP snapshot you take today and then you compare it to August is going to be completely different. So maybe deviating too much might not be the strategy just because it's going to naturally deviate. But I think definitely separating your approach from the tournaments that fill up quickly. I mean, these things are different, right? It's like when you get the generic question about should I trade for X player or Y player, like league formats, positioning, like all these things matter. So, understand the settings of whatever you're entering and tweak your approach a little bit differently. But yeah, let's get into some specific players. The Wicks train is chugging along. But is there anybody else this week that you found yourself drafting a bunch of, JJ?
Yeah, I'll start with Marquise Brown. I've realized that the fifth. This isn't one of those examples of like where I do think you should deviate from ADP or where I've been deviating from ADP a little bit is like into the fifth round, where you get some flatness, in my opinion, at the wide receiver position. Like, is there really that big of a difference between Terry McLaurin to Jaden Reed to Marquise Brown to even some of the sixth round guys? You're talking into like some of the Tennessee wideouts, like the two big Tennessee wideouts, or, Chris Godwin, players like that, Jordan Addison. Like, is there really that massive of a difference between those players? And to me, the answer is probably no, right? Like, even historically, if you look at how wide receiver threes have performed, there's not like some dramatic gap between, a wide receiver 36 to wide receiver 43 or something like that. Like it's not so worth it that you need to get the wide receiver 36 every time. And then the other thing too is that I do want to get exposure to like a Patrick Mahomes type. The problem with some of these quarterbacks early is that like Mahomes will go in the fourth round and then you're stuck not necessarily because he'll go late fourth oftentimes or into the fifth. Right. And when that happens, like if you're getting him in round 5, especially, you're then just not able to really stack him very easily. You're because you have to either force it early at the 3-4 turn with Travis Kelce and overspend on Mahomes a little bit. Because I do think there is a little bit more of an opportunity cost there because you are missing out on Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, some very good wide T Higgins, George Pickens, some very good wide receivers. And then you get into the fifth. And if you're in the fifth and you're taking Mahomes, well, then by the time it comes back to you, you're not going to be able to get Xavier Worthy and Marquise Brown because they get drafted. So it's really Rashee Rice that you're stacking Mahomes with, and that feels pretty volatile, right? And so what I've been doing is I've been okay with a Mahomes late, like if I'm at the 101, 102 type spot, getting Mahomes in the late fourth and reaching a little bit there, and then reaching a little bit for Marquise Brown. Brown there was a tweet by Matt Harmon, who obviously is great with wide receivers. Harmon has been steaming up Brown as the most complete wide receiver on that team right now, which I would agree with, where, I've talked about my question marks with Rashee Rice, despite him looking very good on paper and like his yards per route run was great, all of that. I do worry a little bit about how they used him last year and him being a more complete receiver. If they used him the way they used him last year over and over again, year in and year out, he'll be fine from a fantasy perspective. But you obviously want, a more well-rounded wide receiver who can play anywhere and can do and can run any route, because that allows, more flexibility with performance. And so I do think there's question marks there. Xavier Worthy, obviously size, he's a rookie, those types of question marks. Marquise Brown is kind of the default there, who can play any position on the field at wide receiver and sort of be, a decent target hog for Mahomes. I think he could see a 22-ish% target share. So I think he's the most attractive, the more I've thought about it, the most attractive wide receiver on that team by ADP. But then also you look back at some of my season-long analysis that I've done, and middle round wide receivers who are in their 5th or 6th year often break out at a pretty good clip. And so that's because of in my opinion, what I've seen, at least, it's sort of this dichotomy of they're still in the middle rounds despite being, past like they haven't become elite assets yet necessarily, but they're not sunk. Like people are still into them to some degree because they're in the middle rounds. And so just from that, you're saying, okay, maybe there's some talent there because they've stuck around for 5 or 6 years. But also there's a change of scenery oftentimes with those players because either their rookie contracts are up, or if they had a 5th-year option, they're on a new team potentially after those 5 seasons, and that change of scenery might help these guys too. So, I think that Marquise Brown, given all that, given the game theory component and such, he's been someone that I've definitely been going after a lot this week.
And you could tell the Hollywood story, right? Stuck in a kind of compressed Greg Roman Ravens offense, and then goes to Arizona. Kyler off and on with injury. It just never clicked. And now he gets Reed Mahomes. So there's certainly a ton of upside there. When it comes to Rice, you would think that the good thing is that even if he serves a suspension, we'll have him when it's most valuable, right? Yeah. When it comes down to the playoffs in a lot of these underdog formats. So there is obviously some risk there, but you might get him for the most important parts. But yeah, I mean, getting parts of a Mahomes-Reed offense is always going to be a valuable gamble, especially when, they've kind of shown their hand when it comes to Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney in acquiring Brown, and then, of course, using the draft capital on Xavier Worthy. There's another rookie, speaking of Worthy, that you've been interested in at the running back position, and it seems like he's getting steamed up generally in the market as well. The 7th highest mover this week in ADP, up 5.6 spots. What running back is that, JG?
That would be Blake Corum. And look, this is one of those situations where like you don't want to lean into ADP, and when these guys are rising, you're just rising with them. You want to zig a little bit when others are zagging, to extract as much value as possible. But at the same time, I'm okay with simply moving at ADP in this case because I don't think the ADP hype train around Corum is necessarily going to slow down. You had some reports about Kyren Williams' health and such, and there's more talk about Blake Corum being drafted. It's stuff that I don't think should be a surprise necessarily. I think Kyren Williams' health, like that stuff, might be somewhat of a surprise. And I have this in the back of my head, this fear that what if August comes around and we learn more right before the season starts, and we find out that, oh, there's a serious problem with Kyren Williams that they just didn't want to tell us and lead on with because they were hopeful that something would happen over the summer. They also have no
incentive. They have absolutely no incentive to tell us that something is seriously wrong with Kyren Williams.
Exactly. And so my stance right now is in the later rounds, because there's another guy who definitely fits this bill. And I talked about him with Winks, so this will be sort of repetitive, but in that area where you're in like the late 30s at RB into the early 40s, and RB 39 I think is where Corum has been at, and then like the other guy who I think is a smash right now at ADP is Zach Charbonnet. The more I've thought about Charbonnet, his situation, the fact that Seattle's offense should look different this year, that's something that's a spoiler, a little teaser for later when I talk to Winks, but Charbonnet I've preached this for a while about ambiguous backfields, where when you have an ambiguous backfield, this isn't like totally ambiguous, but it is ambiguous to some degree where, it's a new coaching staff, this backfield, we don't know exactly how it's going to be split. And we would assume that Charbonnet is going to see some work in that backfield. It's not like it's all Kenneth Walker's backfield. And when you have an ambiguous backfield, you want to look at how these guys are being projected and if their projection is sitting at their ADP. Okay. And then you can say to yourself, okay, if the projection is at ADP, okay, so let me just give you an example. Zach Charbonnet, RB42. Projection, RB41. Okay. So he's basically at ADP with his projection. But that projection assumes health to Kenneth Walker. It assumes that Kenneth Walker is the RB1 in his backfield. We have to ask ourselves, what happens if, number one, the new coaching staff doesn't want to split the backfield up the way that we think they're going to split it up? Or number two, what happens if Kenneth Walker gets hurt? If Kenneth Walker gets hurt, like if Kenneth Walker were out of the picture for Seattle this season, Zach Charbonnet would probably be being drafted around where Kenneth Walker's being drafted right now, if not higher. Like he'd probably be in the Rachaad White range right now. Like why wouldn't he be? And so to me, I think there's a lot of upside there. And then I sort of look at, like, this is the way that my brain has been changing a little bit with best ball, where, you look at someone like Jerome Ford, who I do think has a projection, should see, and by has a projection, I mean should score some fantasy points because of Nick Chubb's injury, just the ambiguity in that backfield. But if you look at how they used him last year when Nick Chubb was not in the lineup, Jerome Ford saw over a 60% running back rush share once last season. And so to assume that Ford has, bell cow upside, I think is foolish, just given what we saw last season in that backfield. Whereas Charbonnet actually does have bell cow upside, especially if Kenneth Walker's out just for a week or two. Like, what if that week is week 17 where we need him the most, right? I just don't see that kind of upside with a guy like Jerome Ford, who's going to go ahead of Zach Charbonnet. So that's all the same logic you could argue with Blake Corum. I think the difference with Corum is his ADP is a little bit higher than his projection, right? Like I think it's more glaring with Charbonnet than it is Corum. But look, the further we get closer, or the closer we get to the season, that gap in projection between Kyren Williams and Blake Corum could shrink, right? And we could see a situation where eventually Corum's projection is at his ADP, and that's definitely sort of that break-even point where you need to pounce because of that contingent upside.
Yeah, I mean, and the market's telling you everything about what they think about this Rams offense, with Puka Nacua going so high, Cooper Kupp going so high, and then obviously Kyren as well, even though he has dropped a hair. Like, we want shares of this Stafford McVay offense that's going to play a bunch indoors and we know is going to be schemed up and score a bunch of points. So, yeah, to having the contingent upside at, an 8-round discount right now for Blake Corum is quite valuable. You got another running back here on this list that you want to talk about, middle rounds. You want to talk about the tier of running backs here. My eyes had like a cartoon character popped out of my head when I saw that you drafted this player, because you've been dumping on him a little bit this offseason, JJ. But when you have a large portfolio, you can't have 0.0% of somebody. So what back did you draft that you want to talk about?
Yeah, look, the tier of Josh Jacobs to Rachaad White is an interesting one, because I think that I've said this from the start. Like, I think Jacobs was being way over drafted like a month ago when he was going, in the third round often. But now I'm getting him in round 5, like not infrequently. Like, I've gotten him a couple times in round 5, which I think makes sense, because I think that he should be in a tier with Isaiah Pacheco, James Cook if you want to. I actually have Rachaad White over James Cook. The James Cook thing, I don't know if his upside is really super evident. It's just strange to me that he's being ranked where he's being ranked. I think that he should be just a little bit lower. But regardless, Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco, those kinds of players. I think Jacobs, sure, belongs in there, but he's been going a lot earlier than that. But I've kind of taken a step back too, and I've liked Rachaad White. I've liked Isaiah Pacheco. I still like both of them more than consensus generally does. But I do, I'm trying not to be super overweight with those players necessarily, because I want to be a little bit more open-minded to, with Rachaad White being wrong about Bucky Irving, because I don't really like Bucky Irving that much as a prospect. With Isaiah Pacheco, I did the study on running back prospect scores and how that might help us out in redraft. And it didn't really paint a favorable picture for Pacheco. So like once you get to that, honestly, dude, once you get past like Devon Achane, even Devon Achane, you could argue, has some warts, right? But once you get into like where Kyron's at, it's like, okay, what's going to happen here? And then you get like Derrick Henry, he's 30 years old. And then Josh Jacobs, you have a potential split backfield because of what Matt LaFleur has done historically. And Jacobs wasn't very good last year. And then Isaiah Pacheco, like you realize that the running back dead zone might start at like RB7 this year, you know, like,
yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah. That's the scary part. But I think it goes back to, so I actually talk about this with Hayden a little bit. It's like, you have these elite tight ends, this elite tight end group. You're kind of just throwing the dart, hoping that one of those guys ends up being the elite tight end this year. Just like with this running back group, I don't think all of them are going to end up being bell cows in their offenses, but I do think that there's a higher chance that they become bell cows than maybe someone drafted, maybe even like a Kenneth Walker or an Aaron Jones or something like that who go in the next round. But I still think the sweet spot for running backs, honestly, it's just, you got to kind of just lean into ADP a little bit. The sweet spot continues to be in that like Jonathan Brooks, like high end RB2, low end RB1, high end RB3, low end RB2 range, where you get the Steelers running backs, Jonathan Brooks. Like there's realistically, when you take a step back and you think about it from a ceiling standpoint, there's not that huge of a difference between those kinds of players versus the 5th round guys. So my general stance here is that like as you're drafting, round 2, you'll notice, is not a whole lot different than like round 3 and into round 4 at times. And then, once you get into round 5, it's not a whole lot different than what you're going to get into round 6 and round 7 at times. And so you just have to play that properly. And that's why I'm okay with going back, just full circle, going back to the Marquise Brown thing. I'm okay with reaching a little bit from an ADP perspective to get better team builds and then just hope that, those are the stacks that end up hitting.
And just a point of not to be stubborn, right? There's a point in certain drafts with certain builds where you're just going to have to take a player that you might not love, but might fit your stack, might fit that team. And even Josh Jacobs can fall to a round that makes him a value.
Yeah. I will say, so I talked to Hayden Winks of Underdog, does amazing analysis. He did a super data heavy deep dive on Best Ball Manias over the first 4 Best Ball Manias, looking at optimal roster construction, how many wide receivers you should have by round 7, et cetera, like really doing a deep dive. And so I talked to him about this, and spoiler alert, that running back range, he finds it kind of interesting based on the data, based on what we've seen, throughout Best Ball Mania history. So I guess without further ado, here's my interview with Mr. Hayden Winks. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play best ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to underdogfantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. That guide will then be emailed to you when it launches on July 1st. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. So Hayden, you recently wrote an amazing article. We'll be referencing the article a lot throughout today's interview, but you looked at what sort of worked well or what's worked in general during all 4 years of Best Ball Mania. But before we sort of dig into all of that, I just want to ask you, just generally speaking, do you think that the market, the way that people are drafting, average draft position, all that good stuff, do you think the market might sort of overemphasize some of the historical data that we're looking at because of limited samples? Or do you think that, and I'm not saying that what you looked at was incorrect, it was absolutely what we need, like inject that content right into me, right? But do you think that there is some limitation, or do you think that like the market is just like looking at what happened last year and then just overemphasizing what's going to happen then this year?
It depends on who you ask. Some people believe it's nearly useless. Others think it's everything. I'm obviously somewhere in between. And my whole philosophy with this is the more we zoom into things, the noisier the data is, because we are more or less working off 4 seasons of data here. But if we kind of zoom out, then I think some of the other principles like diminishing returns and other kind of philosophies that go into best ball start getting evened out, and I actually start believing in the data. And what I mean by like zooming in, if we like looked at, for example, which positions to draft in the first and second rounds. Well, in the first 2 years of Best Ball Mania, it would have said draft running back starts. And if we applied that for Best Ball Mania 3 and Best Ball Mania 4, then we would have lost a lot of money, because the wide receiver teams then became the teams to draft in the early rounds. So if you're just trying to zoom in on which players to draft in the rounds 1 and 2, that's where I think the small sample size, that's where I think the noise is. But if I say you should draft 5 or 6 running backs by the 18th round, I think all of a sudden that sample size is growing there. And the other kind of example that I keep using is if you zoom in on the, should I draft an elite tight end over the last 4 years? Well, you're zooming too far in on, is Travis Kelce good or not? And rather than like, how is this position going to evolve once Travis Kelce is out of the prime of his career? Same thing with some of the other elite tight ends. So I want to kind of like walk this line of how, like, obviously zooming in is helpful for finding the exact strategy. But if we zoom in too close on a small sample size, you're going to be led astray way too often.
I've kind of felt like I haven't dug into like player win rate stuff very much, because this is the first year that I'm like really, really digging into best ball data and talking to people like yourself, who's very, very good and into this kind of stuff. But like, I feel similarly to player win rate data where, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, this player last year, you know, won at a 16% clip or whatever, so he was better than any other typical player in his range, etc. But sometimes you look at that player, and I've only done it at like a high level, but sometimes you'll look at it and those players are simply dictated by ADP, it seems like, where like if they're, you know, last season, Christian McCaffrey, let's say, goes 4th overall or 3rd overall, wherever he went. And then the player in the second round who's going, third to last in the second round. And then the 2-3 turn guys, they all, even if they were terrible, it didn't matter because they were all attached to Christian McCaffrey in that way. Is that similar to what you're sort of saying here? Yeah,
you see that. The other example with that is, let's say the wide receiver 3 on a team that went off didn't perform well, but the quarterback and the wide receiver 1 and everyone's stacking. Yeah. All of a sudden, that player that wasn't even in the lineup just happened to be on the same team. So there's too much overlap. So I think like because there's only 4 years of data, we have to be really smart with how we're applying some of the data. I think if you completely said it's small samples noise, I'm not using anything, that's going to be a problem. But for me, we really have to kind of take some of the data, but also just like, does this make sense? Like as a strategy, does this make sense? Yes. And then the other thing, what we're seeing, and we have a question about this later on, also what's happened with ADP. Because if I'm taking the data where all of the running backs were drafted in rounds 1 and 2, but now those type of players are being drafted in rounds 3 and 4, now like our strategies are completely getting warped just because the prices have changed as well. So it's a fun game because I think we can kind of put some guardrails on like the general strategies, but every single year we're gonna have to see what ADP is looking like, what the player projections are looking like, and then also not just for like the player projections in the first couple rounds, but who's available later in the rounds. Because if I think that there's a positions loaded in rounds 14 through 18, well, I want to save some of the roster spots for those guys later on. So it's this whole game that we have to play, and every single year is going to be a little bit different.
So speaking of ADP, I feel like every year, I'm sure this is true too. Every year, wide receivers just get drafted earlier and earlier in these things. This year, they're going earlier than ever. But you did, within that piece, to get a little bit more specific about the things that you talked about in that piece, you talked about sort of the number of wide receivers that you should have rostered through X number of rounds, which I think is really, really helpful for people because it gives them that flexibility to say, okay, I don't need to go 4 wide receivers to start a draft. I could to sort of hit this mark that is generally optimal. But you know, I can kind of stray away. Maybe I get a running back here or a tight end here, etc. But can you talk about sort of what that data suggests?
Yeah. So this is exactly what I was talking about, where I'm not giving you advice what to do specifically in round 2, but by round 7, that's kind of like where we start seeing some of the like the positional values just kind of like drop off. Like most of the good players are drafted by round 7. Having 4 to 5 wide receivers through round 7 has been optimal or nearly optimal every single year, which is probably a pretty good thing that this is going to hold up or be generally true. So 4 or 5 receivers through round 7. And the good news about that is only 49% of teams had 4+ wide receivers through round 7 last year. So like in terms of just like, it's easy to accomplish. I'm not saying you have to go completely wide receiver heavy, 4 or 5 through round 7. You have detours for elite onesies or running backs, only 4 or 5. And most teams aren't even doing this. And this has been profitable every single year. So like if there's one thing to take away from this podcast, 4 or 5 wide receivers by round 7. And actually what's happened in the last couple years, even a 6 wide receiver has been profitable. That was really not the case in Best Ball Mania 1 and Best Ball Mania 2. And now we have these like increasing wide receiver price tags. It's going to make this a little bit more complicated, but 4 or 5 wide receivers by round 7, 4 to 6 wide receivers through round 10, which is like more or less like the same kind of benchmark. And then 7 or 8 wide receivers through the last round. And now obviously how many players you draft at each position should change based off of how early you drafted them. So there's actually some teams where I'll draft only 6 wide receivers. If I went 5 wide receivers in the first 6-ish rounds, well, there's really no point. It's not a good sign if my 8th wide receiver is in the lineup. That's just basically saying I made some critical mistakes. So this is what the diminishing returns is. Just you don't want to overinvest into a single position. And so basically what happens is you kind of have these guardrails, and depending on how early you drafted the positions, be on the low side of it. If you kind of punted off the positions, then now that's the time to draft the 8th wide receiver.
You know, I get the question all the time about how season long translates to best ball, right? And I actually think that the general idea here is something that is pretty transferable from the stuff that I've researched in season long versus what you're talking about here in best ball. And in that early round wide receivers are, you know, like if you can hit on an early round running back, it's the best thing that you could possibly do in fantasy football. If you really, like if you had Christian McCaffrey last year, despite the fact where he went, how many points he was scoring made him the MVP of fantasy football, even though the cost to acquire was so insane. If you can get those running backs, yes, like you need those first and foremost, at least from a managed league season long standpoint. But the data that I found is that in the middle rounds, you know, when you get into like that 6 to 9-ish range in a 12-team league, those middle rounds are better suited for running back than wide receiver generally. Like we've seen those ambiguous backfields and guys kind of emerge as like RB3s turning into low end RB1s or something like that. And so like that's what this is sort of saying, is that the wide receivers that that are going to be difference makers are generally going to come earlier in your draft, right? Is that do you think like that's what the data is telling you, is that you can hit on later round running backs better than you can hit on later round wide receivers?
I do think that is true. And I think the bigger part is that if you look at the spike weeks, which is like, all right, has a wide receiver, you pick your kind of baseline, scoring 20 half PPR points, like 80% of them, of the wide receivers that are doing that on a week to week basis, they're being drafted in the top 36. Like very rarely, like Puka, you'll get a Puka, you'll get a Tank Dell, you'll get guys I'll go on some stretches, which will help. But the guys that are consistently putting up the top end scores are the wide receivers that are drafted early on. So that does not mean you have to have 5 great guys like that. You can have 2, like let's say you had Justin Jefferson and then Cooper Kupp bounces back this year in round 3-4. Those can be your 2 guys that are going to be giving me all the spike weeks. And then you need the rest of the guys to kind of put up 15 points, 20 points here and there. But I do think that there is a little bit something to that. Like people, I think, underestimate how consistently good the best wide receivers are. And that's kind of where I'm kind of leaning towards this year, is maybe I don't need the 6th good wide receiver, decent wide receiver. I think right now with the wide receiver prices going up, I'm going to draft 4 decent ones, but I'm going to really bank that those guys are really good. And historically, the top wide receivers, if you get those guys right, those guys very rarely is it 6 points, 24 points. A lot of the times it's like 24 points, 14 points, 25 points, 13 points. And guess what? 13 points, 14 points is good enough to be in your best ball starting lineup. So I think that's kind of my takeaway this year with wide receiver prices going up. I'm not drafting as many good ones. I still want to hit that 4 wide receivers through round 7, but I'm not going to draft the 6th wide receiver with the prices up. I'm probably not even going to draft the 5th wide receiver with the prices up. I just need the guys that I drafted up top to really kind of hit my lineup every single time.
do you think then with these wide receiver prices the way that they are, what you just talked about at wide receiver, do you think there's any merit to sort of zigging while everyone's zagging? And what I mean by that is not a hero RB type build or anything like that, where you're just getting one and then you're surrounding that player with a bunch of wide receivers. I mean, like we had robust RB strategies, years and years ago when we were doing like MFL 10s and such. Yep. But even like the transition to Underdog and people playing on Underdog more and more, you still saw it, especially, whenever, 4 or so years ago when Best Ball Mania really started happening. Do you think that there's any merit to going with a robust RB approach this season because we're seeing the market shift in such a wide receiver heavy way?
The big difference with robust RB is that back in 2020, when the running backs were being drafted so early and the wide receiver prices were like more like fair, I guess.
Yeah.
You had to go running back, and then you hit your wide receivers. Now a robust RB team is like, all right, drafted Justin Jefferson. Now I have Achane. I drafted Waddle, and now I'm drafting Pacheco and Josh Jacobs, where I'm getting like 3 running backs, but they're kind of like rounds 2, 5, and 6.
Yeah.
Where like that's like more just balance. Like very rarely are you going to see a team on Underdog go like running back starts. And I would not recommend that. I think it's okay to go running back, but you have to really catch up with wide receivers very quickly after that. But I am drafting 3 running backs through round 7, round 8 more this year than I was previously, just because in my opinion, that you talk about, there's that kind of like at a certain point, like right now, round 4, 5 is kind of where I feel it, where the wide receivers, like, it's like, man, I like Jaden Reed, but do I really want to draft Jaden Reed in the 5th round right now when like other guys like James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco are like kind of right there next to him? I don't know if I want to be doing that. So I've been kind of finding more tiebreakers at the running back spot just based off the projections, but it's not the old days where like I'm drafting a kind of fringy RB1 versus an elite wide receiver 1.
Exactly.
Like everyone's drafting a wide receiver in round 1, and then we get into like the harder decisions in round 2 right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the opportunity cost, right? Like the opportunity cost equation just shifts dramatically. And the things that I've looked at from a season-long perspective historically has shown that like it's very clean, but like RB 12-ish range. So like when you're only looking within the position, that's usually where I see the drop off occur, like just given the ADP sources that I've looked at. And so like before the RB 12 was going, like you said, in 2020, I would assume end of like round 2 into round 3, right? Oh, yeah. And then now you get Rashad White falling into the 6th at times where people are going these super wide receiver heavy and then obviously getting an elite tight end kind of approach. And it makes it a little bit easier to just go with those players, even if you did get one of those anchors earlier on. So I think, like, to your point, it's not really like an extreme zig while everyone's zagging, but it's still a semi way to differentiate, a little bit. You also did a lot of work at the tight end position. I've been on record. I talked about this with Karain last week. I've said this on the show already in the past, but I think that the way people approach tight end might end up making or breaking some seasons this season, just because, we've seen, like you said, was Travis Kelce good or not this year with these earlier round tight end approaches? We've seen that, but this year we don't have that kind of tight end. The earliest tight end is Sam Laporta, who I think probably doesn't belong necessarily in his like own tier where he gets drafted. I feel like the Laporta thing is a little bit of a stack force type situation, with a St. Brown and like getting one of the San Francisco wide receivers. But regardless, even if you like Sam Laporta, tight end 1 in his own tier, I mean, he's still going late 3rd into early 4th oftentimes. And so we're getting this like this drop in tight end, the elite tight ends and where they're going. What do you think that means for 2024 and whether or not going with an elite tight end is really the way? Because I know that you've talked a lot about going in the opposite direction in these drafts too.
So the reason why there's not a 1st or 2nd round tight end where we've been drafting Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews at times is because those guys just aren't in the primes of their career. Like if you just did projections, they just would not project as well this year as they did previously. So to me, I don't want to say, oh, well, the tight end one is typically the 12th overall pick, and now he's a 30th overall pick, so I must draft them.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at Sam Laporta. He does not project as well as prime Travis Kelce, prime Gronk, prime Tony Gonzalez, you name the player. He's a good player. He could do that. I'm not ruling that out, but it's not as bankable as the prime guy. So I don't think that's like the way I want to look at this. I want to like really stick with the player projections for this upcoming season, because it goes back to the first question is, there is no historical data telling me is an elite onesie player good or not, because the sample size literally is just, is Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews good or are they bad? And that varies depending on the season just because it's such a small sample. Sure. So what's actually happened is the rest of the elite tight ends, like let's say tight end 4, tight end 5, tight end 6, those guys are actually up a full round. Yeah. And I think it's just because the wide receivers are up, the elite tight ends are up, and the running backs are down, like not exaggerating, like 2 full rounds from where they were 2 years ago. So like the running back 22 is now being drafted 2 full rounds versus where they were just 2 years ago. So that means that the tight ends are getting pushed up. So like a player like Dalton Kincaid, who could end up being Sam Laporta of this last season, something like that, he's now being drafted to me like pretty close to like where his ceiling more or less is. And like this, like kind of, we're extending the definition of elite tight end. Kyle Pitts is one, George Kittle's one. Typically the tight end 4, 5, 6, 7 are not being drafted as early as they are now. So it's kind of this like weird dynamic of, I don't even know who's an elite tight end anymore. Like it doesn't feel like anybody truly is to me. But the running back prices right next to these tight ends, a lot of the time, I'm kind of clicking them instead. Like I want the Isaiah Pacheco instead of the Sam Laporta or that. I do like Mark Andrews, who goes way later, but I don't think that there's like a true elite tight end right now, which is fine. It's hard to be prime Travis Kelce, but I don't think that's an excuse to say I'm drafting Sam Laporta in round 3, like you said.
Yeah, it's interesting because the research that I've done historically has shown that like middle round tight ends, if you would call it that, like the guys who are drafted like after tight end 3, usually, you know, in that like tight end 4 to tight end 10 range, those guys have been historically horrific bets in fantasy football.
Yes.
Like every data point has shown, because that's like where, like for instance, like even like Greg Olsen, when he would step in and be that dude, but he was more of a floor play than a ceiling play for years, you know, like that's the problem that you often run into. I think that we're in a position now, and maybe you disagree with this, we're in a position now where I think maybe 1 or 2 of those guys will end up emerging and being like giving you some sort of like favorable win rate or something like that, right? Like like whether it's McBride and Kelce or whether it's Andrews. Like I like Andrews a lot too, but then I do think that you could run into like a Kincaid, or if things go south with Pitts, I'm not saying that I think that's the way things are going to go, but like they could end up sinking your team. Like it could be because the opportunity cost is still fairly significant in that range. And so would you agree that the darts to throw would still be those guys versus, so maybe my question should be this. Would you go with a throw a dart at one of those guys, or just wait and get 3 of them late, like fairly late? Or like, to me, I now picture like the middle tight ends as like the Fergusons of the world. You know what I mean? Like is he really going to win you a league? Probably not. He's literally just sitting there because of stacks. You know what I mean?
So the opportunity cost is way down at that. Like
it is
2 or 3 rounds.
That's the question.
Doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is a huge 100%. Difference.
Yeah.
So last year I was only late round tight end, and I like when I mean late round tight end, I was mean like round 14, 17, and 18. Like those are my 3 tight ends, because this is the position that has the most week to week volatility. It's the position that is most tied to touchdowns, which we are extremely bad at predicting, and we don't need a floor in best ball. We're only taking your best guy or best player of that position every single week. So I would just say, all right, I have 3 late round tight ends. Hopefully one of them scores a touchdown this week. And if they don't, that's all right, because it's also the position that separates the least. Like an elite running back and elite wide receiver are completely lapping the flex position versus like, even when Travis Kelce, like sometimes he goes for 35 and that's insane. But a lot of the Travis Kelce's like spike weeks are like 22 points, which are still only like above replacement 14 points. Like a really good Justin Jefferson week is like 37 points, and the wide receiver 36 on that week is still scoring like 10 points. So it's like it's a larger gap. But last year was just the perfect sweet spot. We had so many young tight ends in there. To me, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, those type of guys, George Kittle, I was less scared about, just because they're kind of going like this on a per game basis right now. They're missing more time, those type of things. And there's also like more target competition and other reasons why. But we had like Sam Laporta. I thought Luke Musgrave had a chance. Jake Ferguson was going in the last round basically for a while there in the early parts of Best Ball Mania, attached to Dak Prescott. So last year was lights out. This year I'm struggling compared to last year to find late round tight end. So what I'm doing is like what you said. Jake Ferguson, you're my tight end 1. And then in the last 2 rounds, I'm still drafting a tight end. And that's part of the conversation is even though the late round tight ends don't project very well, the really late round running backs, the really late round wide receivers, they project even worse. Like right now, early on, it's May 28th right now. We don't have the answers of NFL teams' RB2s. We don't have the answers who's going to be out there in 3 wide receiver sets. We need training camp reports to kind of solidify that. So right now, I want the guy that I know is just going to be on the field at tight end and pick me up some points in round 16, 17, 18. And then later on in August, when I have a more crystal clear picture, who's actually the RB2, who's actually the wide receiver 3, then the tight ends and the running back prices or the projected points kind of even out. So for right now, I am drafting like 2 late round tight ends. But this year, instead of like my first tight end being in round 14, now it's probably David Njoku, a falling Mark Andrews, maybe a stacked version of one of the elite tight ends. But typically it's like Jake Ferguson or Pat Freiermuth.
Yeah.
Plus like 2 absolute scrubs.
Freiermuth to me seems like one of the best bargains at tight end.
Yep.
Like he's the one where if I don't get a tight end early and I'm not able to get like in that Njoku range or something like that, just like have some stability. It's like I feel like Freiermuth could easily just finish in that same tier as those guys. You know. So that's definitely one. I think like what you're talking about, and the thing that I keep thinking about is like it's almost a psychological problem where like. When you go with 3 late round tight ends, on paper, they suck, right? Like on paper, it feels so uncomfortable, but you have to keep in mind what you're saying in that the range that you really need, like the ceiling that these tight ends need to hit in a given week is not very high. It's not super, super significant. And so even if they do bust in a given week, you're not dead, right? Whereas if that happens at other positions, you are kind of dead because there's a lot bigger of a gap there and more points you'd be hypothetically giving up. So it makes a lot of sense. Do you ever go with 4 tight ends in these things, or are you strictly a 3 tight end guy?
So historically, 2 and 3 tight end teams have been like optimal, and it really just depends how early you're drafting your first guy, etc. 4 tight end teams have been pretty close to that, but I would have to like really look at it. I'm sure that's like, okay, rounds 15, 16, 17, 18.
Yeah.
Like, it was like the last 4. And you do need one of those guys to break out most likely. Now, we have had some random breakouts. Like Darren Waller at one point was a late round pick, and then he finished top 5 on the year. Jake Ferguson was this close to being like a top 4 or 5 tight end if he had got a little bit luckier in the touchdown department. So we do get some like random breakouts sometimes as well. But I do think this year just doesn't look as good just because we had like 5 rookie tight ends last year that like were going to get on the field immediately. And we only needed 1 or 2 of them to break out. And that's exactly what we had.
Let's talk quarterback. Are you an advocate in these things of a late round quarterback strategy, or are you an elite guy and then kind of just get some secondary quarterback that no one really cares about as the QB too?
I want an elite quarterback. We're very good at projecting the elite quarterbacks. And also you absolutely tanked the late round quarterback strategy because we can't buy a guy that can use his legs past round 8 now. So
yeah, that's true.
You kind of ruined that for us. But yeah, it's fine. Like I like Anthony Richardson, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen. I've been a big proponent of elite quarterbacks. We're pretty dang good at projecting those guys versus some of the other positions. And then the other thing, I have this metric, fantasy points over replacement, like using the best ball scoring format on Underdog. And every single year, the quarterbacks rank higher than where they are in ADP every single year by like a full round or 2. So I'm not sure if we fully grasp like how much half PPR helps out the quarterbacks because there's just less points going over to tight ends, running backs, and wide receivers. Quarterbacks don't catch passes, obviously. So they're a little bit more valuable in half PPR than in full PPR. And maybe that's the reason why they're not getting drafted as high. But like, I want Anthony Richardson. I want Kyler Murray. I want the guys that could use their legs and also play on like fast-paced offenses, have good wide receivers, etc., like that. So typically I have 8 elite quarterback. Then it's based off the stack, like the other positions I need. If I'm going to go 2 quarterbacks or 3 quarterbacks when I'm going to draft that second and third quarterback. But very rarely am I going like, all right, it's Justin Herbert this year, who's like quarterback 16, and then like Drake May and Bo Nix. Like that to me is not enough. Just because we've gotten so good at like who the top 12 quarterbacks are going to be every year.
Yeah, look, you say that it's me who did that. I say it's Lamar Jackson. I think things really switched when Lamar had his MVP season and he was a late round quarterback, like QB 12 or so with an ADP. That following year was when people really started to shift their focus to mobile quarterbacks more. I've written about that for years now. I actually remember writing about it after his MVP season, being like, what's going to change the late round quarterback strategy is literally the market, right? Like that's all this is. It's not based on like anything else other than how people draft. And people started to shift their focus and realize, oh, if I get a mobile guy late, yeah, I should draft that. But then obviously that just drives up costs. I think right now the latest mobile guy seems like Jaden Daniels, like a guy who could like potentially break fantasy, but then there's a lot of iffiness to a rookie quarterback and a profile like that, right? So like, I think the real line seems to be Kyler, which is why Kyler to me is like the one of the quarterbacks I've just been going to so frequently because he's the last in his tier hypothetically, and so you can just kind of go and attack that. But it makes sense. Are you? Let me. If you get like a Josh Allen, are you ever getting 3 quarterbacks in a situation like that? Or like, are you, because I've drafted a team, like I'm trying to learn here, I'm trying to get better here. I've drafted teams of Josh Allen and Bryce Young and said, I'm going to roll with this. Let's hope that that's enough. Do you think that's enough?
I think it is, like, that's a totally viable strategy. I think early in the off season, because we don't have the wide receiver 3, running back 2 all sorted out, I do like the super late round quarterbacks. Like, to me, Bo Nix is going undrafted or around 18. Yeah. He's probably going to start 17 games. Are you sure the wide receiver you're drafting in the 18th round is even going to be on the field? Because I'm not sure.
Definitely
so
not.
I think at some point early in the offseason, going with a third quarterback with Josh Allen, I wouldn't recommend it like very often. But if it's Josh Allen and then literally Bryce Young and Bo Nix, I think that's okay. Later on in the offseason, I might disagree with that. But the earliest you should be drafting your quarterback too, historically, has been round 8, 9, which is kind of the breaking point of when the rest of these positions fall off. That was the year when I think it was Matthew Stafford and Tom Brady were kind of like the quarterback 10-ish, right in that range, around 8, 9, 10. And if you had both of those two guys, you absolutely crush in best ball. But usually you don't want to go Josh Allen with Anthony Richardson. That's too much draft capital. You can go Josh Allen with Jaden Daniels if you want to, but at that point you definitely have to call it quits.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. And yeah, I mean, look, there's going to be some pocket passer that has some unsustainable touchdown rate, like a Brock Purdy or something last year, where they just come through and they are values and they end up working out. It's just a matter of playing probability and knowing that the ceiling is still coming from the guys with the mobility.
What is interesting about best ball though, and how, like, we haven't talked about stacking that much. Stacking is like just as important as the roster construction, all that stuff. If you're not stacking, you're definitely behind the 8 ball.
Yeah. In
best ball, if you can find the pocket quarterback that has an outlier season, now you're dragging up more players. Like the dual threat quarterbacks are only dragging up one player. Like Anthony Richardson, if you miss out on Michael Pittman and you just want to draft AD Mitchell or Josh Downs, pick your poison there. You don't have to draft 3 of them. Well, right now, Matthew Stafford, if you went Cooper Kupp and Demarcus Robinson and Colby Parkinson, and Matthew Stafford turns into the 40 touchdown quarterback, well, all of a sudden now you've like raised 3 or 4 of the players that you drafted too. So it's like kind of this catch-22 where in redraft, you just want the dual threat guy no matter what. In best ball, like in the perfect team was the Tom Brady year back with Tampa Bay, where he brought up Gronk, AB, Chris Godwin, everybody was going crazy just because he went for an outlier touchdown season. It's just hard to project.
That's very interesting. That's a very, very good point. I remember Mike Leone did a study on stacking in season long, like maybe like 5 years ago. And I always would reference it because it was just this idea of like you shouldn't necessarily do it like from a season long perspective. The benefit in doing it isn't necessarily the weekly output. It is obviously from a standpoint in best ball, like you want that ceiling, and you do in season long, you still want the ceiling, but there's this other benefit that's arguably just as good, is that if that quarterback ends up going off and having a crazy season, he's bringing, as you're saying, bringing the rest of his pass catchers up with him. I think one example was like when Alex Smith had a big season before like the Patrick Mahomes takeover and stuff. It's like, the other guys in that offense all outperformed ADP because Alex Smith did. That's how important the quarterback position is. So one topic that does get brought up a lot is how far to stray away from average draft position. I know that you've done work on this for years and sort of looking at like like, you know, if a guy's getting drafted 50th overall on average and you end up taking him 40th overall, you know, is that a suboptimal thing, or are you differentiating properly? Is it like at what cost? Like does it matter if you're reaching for guys frequently, or should we do that, or should we really stick to the ADP plan?
Unfortunately, it's very bad. I want to go full YOLO. It's fun to do it. If you have one team on best ball and you want to let it rip, go for it. But the data is very clear. Like, the more you reach, the worse your team is. And it's like staggering. In fact, the teams that on average draft their players after ADP are the best teams. Just straight up. If you just every single time just took the best player available, more or less, and made sure you're stacking, got the roster construction. But if you took the guy that slid 14 spots after ADP, I mean, historically, that has just been a lights out pick. So there are times when you can reach, and we can kind of get to those if we want to, for like kind of like ownership overlap and combination.
Yeah, let's hear it. Yeah.
There's some ways to do that. So like in the second round, in the first and second round, like let's say you have like the 10th spot. The player that, like when we talked about with the CMC example earlier in the show, the 10th overall player and the 14th overall player in ADP are drafted on the same teams all the time, especially if they're the same position. Because like if you're a heavy wide receiver guy and you have the 10th pick, or you're drafting AJ Brown every single time. Right. And then every single time you're also drafting Drake London. If you want to switch things up, what I like to do is in the early second round, reach for somebody that's on the other side of the draft board. So instead of drafting Drake London 14th overall, let's go over to 22nd overall and draft Devon Achane. Because very rarely are you going to get a player, AJ Brown and Devon Achane, on the same team because they're on the opposite sides of the board. Now, this strategy is more beneficial once we get August, because we've seen, all right, 90% of the best ball teams have been drafted. Now I know for sure that this is going to be a very unique build. So there's some reasons why in the early round 2, I like to reach, especially because round 2 this year, it feels like nobody should be a second round pick. Like they're all bad second round picks.
Yes.
Like you can't make a good argument that this player should be in the second round for any of these guys. So to me, just draft whoever. And I would rather just take the smaller ownership overlap between the rounds 1 and round 2. And then the second time I like to reach is when I'm on the clock in the 170s and 180s and then the 190s. So call it round 15 through 17. Well, what happens is once you get to about 185th overall in ADP, all of a sudden those players aren't drafted 100% of the time. If you draft somebody with an ADP of 212, they're being drafted 15% of the time. Well, historically, those guys aren't that much worse of a bet than the guys with an ADP of 180. So you're basically saying these guys are projected for the same, but one of the players is drafted 100% of the time, and the other guy is projected 20% of the time. Well, of course, you want to take the ownership advantage, just like we do with DFS. So I often take a player 200th in ADP with my 173rd overall pick.
Yeah. Is there like a sweet spot? Like, I'm assuming you can go too far on the ADP list, and if you get past 250, it's like this guy's just dead to begin with. Yeah.
So it's just based off how ADP is calculated. If they're not drafted, they don't get a 250 ADP. They're still just it's NA. And then he get drafted 216. So the players that have an ADP of 215 point something, which means they're drafted 1% of the time, 5% of the time. Yeah. Those guys suck always. If you think that you got this guy right, guess what? You didn't. They're going to be bad. So kind of my rule is if it's a 214 ADP, okay. You have a chance there. If it's a 215.3, guess what? It's not time to go there. So the sweet spot to me is a tight end that has an ADP of 212. All right, I'm on the clock with 180th overall. Instead of drafting the guy that's being drafted 100% of the time, give me the guy with a 212 ADP. And that's just based off the drafted rate.
Yeah, I think it's nice to hear that though too, because towards the end of your draft, rounds 15, round 16, you're often in this place where you're like, oh man, I got to complete this stack, or I got to find something to, and if you reach a little bit there, you're saying that mathematically it's not that big of a deal, but also from a optimizing your lineup roster construction standpoint, it's a good idea to do it too, because you obviously want the stacks and such. So that's definitely good to hear.
Real quick. I have seen people say double digits round, it's 120th overall. ADP doesn't matter. I'm reaching no matter what. Like that's still too early for me. Like we got to get deeper into the draft. I'm talking about let's say round 15 to be a little lenient. But I see people like, oh, it's like 100th overall. Like I'm just going to grab my guys. Like no, that's too early. You think you're smarter than you are. And the other thing is 50% of the time you're going to be able to get the guy that you like after his ADP. ADP.
Yeah, right.
If you look at the histogram of it, it's just like, all right, half the time it's early and then half the time it's late. So you can still get your guys sometimes after ADP, which I mean, that's the way to do it. So typically I'm not reaching on guys 4 picks ahead of ADP is fine. But like if you're constantly doing that, then that's bad.
It's really good to know. All right, last question for you. If you could choose the best value right now, just in drafts at each position, give me the 4 guys that you would be choosing.
I love Isaiah Pacheco, and I don't even like Isaiah Pacheco for running back, like in particular. I thought like coming in, he was pretty raw, and over the last couple of years, he just earned more trust, and there's just like nobody else. Like there's no Jerick McKinnon to steal passing work. And what we saw last year, including the Super Bowl run, he was on the field a ton, and he was catching passes all of a sudden, and this team is going to be so good. I think the Chiefs are going to score way more points just because they can throw the ball downfield, and that's going to open things up. But I do think that people are sleeping on like what Isaiah Pacheco could be. Like he can be a 20 touch guy per game on the best offense in the league. Like typically that's not a 4th or 5th round pick. And that's where he's going right now. So that's kind of like one of the detours we're talking about. Like, all right, I need to have 4 wide receivers. I only get so many detours in the first 7 rounds. Like Isaiah Pacheco is going to be one of my detours. I know that you were a Pacheco guy, like coming out from the jump, and he's gotten better. Like last couple years.
Yeah, I mean, look, he's far better than I ever thought that he was going to be. It was more so just a market game for me, where like things just really aligned from prospect score, and his comp. One of his comps was Damian Williams for me, and like it all just kind of came together to formulate like, let's draft him relentlessly in the 4th round of rookie drafts. I didn't think this was going to happen, but yeah, I mean, it's a good call. I've loved Pacheco as well. In these early drafts, the only thing that scared me is I did last week did an episode on my prospect model and how we can maybe leverage prospect scores for redraft purposes instead of just dynasty purposes. And players who had poor prospect scores, regardless of their age, that were then drafted in the top 24 at running back, had really, really bad hit rates. They didn't exceed ADP expectation at a very good rate. But I'm okay with saying that. Like, I think Pacheco's just mispriced. I think that's more of like a Kyron Williams thing, potentially, as opposed to like a Pacheco thing, just because I do think objectively Pacheco's situation just is totally different than what you're looking at in a typical guy who has the low prospects. It was really fragile, that's really why that data says what it does. But I've written Pacheco up as a player to target as well, so I'm very into him.
Yeah, I mean, he's just insulated by the Chiefs, like just team.
Right.
Wide receiver, I love George Pickens. He's kind of like in the same kind of range. And if I've had a detour early on at running back, I need to draft one of these guys that actually has a ceiling. And to me, George Pickens has that ceiling. Now, the Steelers are not going to be good on offense, but the good news is there's nobody else to throw the ball to. We like Pat Freiermuth on the show, but like Pat Freiermuth hasn't shown like that crazy of an ability yet. So like if George Pickens is as good as what I think he can be, and coming in as a prospect, I know the numbers weren't very, very great, but there was definitely a huge ceiling to attach. And I think that this offense is going to be perfect. Very much better in best ball, just because he's going to be used down the field all the time. But I think that George Pickens, like if we refresh next year and he's the wide receiver 12 in ADP, that would not be totally shocking. I think a lot of the players that are kind of drafted around them have more or less been like kind of solved. Like we know what Christian Kirk and those type of guys are going to provide you. George Pickens at least has a chance to like, boom, he's like all of a sudden 80 yards per game type of guy. And already last year, like I know it was a couple of big plays, but he already had 67 yards per game, 57th overall player in fantasy points over replacement per game. And that was with Deontay Johnson. And that was with probably a worse quarterback situation than what we're getting this year. So just a young player going into his 3rd season. So I think that he's going to be one of the better wide receiver picks.
I love that call. The other thing too is that, you mentioned that the Steelers are likely going to be a bad offense, but it seems like that's just a general market accepted idea, right? Where what if they're actually a little bit better? I mean, Arthur Smith had some success in Tennessee running an offense. And, I think that you could at least look at this more favorably. Like if the way I always think about it is if you put this player in a good situation, like if George Pickens with this type of target share projection were in a better, just a good situation with a very stable, good quarterback, he'd easily be in that second round.
Yep.
Like he'd be in that discussion at least. As like the next, like why would he be so totally different than like a Drake London or something? Yep. You know what I mean?
Completely agree.
So I like that call out.
For quarterbacks, I'll give two. Anthony Richardson's my favorite elite quarterback, and like he used to be in the 7th or 8th round pick. We have to pay like a legit 5th round pick for him, but he was number 1 in fantasy points per dropback last year. I thought he was a better player than most people thought coming out as a college guy. Just talking about like playing NFL football, like not even the fantasy version that we're playing. We've seen Shane Steichen make things work with Gardner Minshew, who I do not think is a good quarterback. They also play with pace. They've also added a field stretcher in AD Mitchell, who I think is going to be very inconsistent, but he at least has some upside in ways that I don't think that Alec Pierce has. So Anthony Richardson's my favorite like elite quarterback. And then for like the talking about like, I need a second quarterback, or I just need a stacking partner. Geno Smith to me is in a great spot. We've seen Geno Smith be like a fringe quarterback one already. Man. And Ryan Grubb, go watch a Husky game. All they do is they pass the ball on every single early down. And not only are they passing it, they're passing it 20 yards downfield constantly. Well, guess what? Not a bad strategy when you have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and then I went back and rewatched JSN. Wasn't blowing me away athletically, but his ball tracking ability downfield was, to me, one of his best traits as a rookie. And they just didn't do that enough with Shane Waldron. If we can get JSN working downfield just to take care of that kind of trait that I saw on tape, all of a sudden Geno Smith can be just ripping the ball up and down the yard. And I also think that the coaching staff that they have are there. It's gonna be pretty modern. Like I know it's a defensive minded head coach, but it comes from the Ravens. He's a young guy. I think they're going to be a little bit more modern and not like the classic Pete Carroll, slow paced, kind of more balanced offense. I would not be surprised if this immediately turns into like a top 10 team in neutral pass rate. And then on top of that, the ADOT is gonna be really high.
Dude, I love hearing this. I felt like Seattle player. I mean, maybe not Metcalf as much just because he goes probably where he generally should probably go. But like, JSN where he goes, I did again, going back to the prospect score stuff, like the wide receiver stuff that I did that dropped on Tuesday. That stuff pointed to JSN actually being a pretty good value where he's going right now. I think the running backs are good values right now. Like Charbonnet, for instance, is being drafted at his projection, right? Like when you have the contingent upside on top of that, it just seems like it's a smash. And then Geno being QB 23, there are ways to get exposure to that offense throughout your draft. You might not be able to stack them late because it's like Noah Fant and they have their 3 wide receivers, and that's probably the 3 wide receivers that are going to see, the most target share in their offenses. But like, man, I feel like Seattle just in general is an undervalued offense right now.
I think Geno Smith's such a value versus where his projection is that I'm okay. If you want to draft Geno Smith without one of the top 3 wide receivers and you're just like, this is just purely based off of, I just need points. I'm okay with that. You don't have to stack every single quarterback every single time. Obviously, it's better, but if it's Geno Smith or some other quarterback that we feel less confident about, just draft Geno Smith. Like this guy can absolutely
I like that
put it on him. And also, number 1 in completion percentage over expected since 2021. Like, he's actually good. So moving on to the tight ends, Noah Fant's my most drafted tight end just because like I just need a tight end usually, and I have a lot of Geno Smith, and it just makes too much sense. But early guys, I like Jake Ferguson. Last year, 2nd in missed tackles force, 6th in yards after the catch per reception, 7th in targets, 8th in yards, 9th in reception. Sounds like a tight end one. Well, he scored -4 touchdowns over expected. And then guess what happens immediately? We go to the NFL playoffs. Immediately what happens in the NFL playoffs? 3 touchdowns.
It doesn't work.
There's regression right there. And what I've also kind of noticed, players that do well in the NFL playoffs, like everyone just takes the regular season data and like that's the data that existed. Well, the NFL playoff data is usually pretty important. So I like to kind of use that, kind of average everything out. So I think Jake Ferguson's a good option. They're going to pass the ball a ton still. And then Colby Parkinson's my deep sleeper. We're getting close to the 215.3 ADP here. He's still in the 214 range, but he got 2 years, $15 million, practically guaranteed. He's a great stacking partner with Matthew Stafford. I drafted him Demarcus Robinson. So he's kind of like a backdoor stack with the Rams. And Colby Parker is a huge target, was fairly productive at Stanford, was always in a rotation with Will Dissly and Noah Fant, but they gave him a starter level money. And I've seen Matthew Stafford obviously have 3 touchdown games. I think Colby Parkinson's like 6-7. So if a couple of those go to him, that's all we need.
All right, so we need to draft Colby Parkinson so that his ADP goes well above that 215 mark, and we can feel confident about him throughout the summer. Hayden, that was awesome, man. I think everyone's going to really love hearing all of that amazing information that you just shared. Let everyone know where they can find you.
I'm Hayden Winks on Twitter, and then Josh Norris and I, we have the Underdog Football Show. You can find our stuff over on YouTube there. So we're doing some best ball stuff, some player take stuff. So not everything's super in the details like this. Sometimes we just say this player is good. So we kind of try to balance that stuff out as well. So thanks for having me. Always appreciate it. And also your stuff, the best ball stuff. It's been so cool to see you flip the switch and talk best ball. We love to have you.
Yeah, man, I appreciate that. It's been a blast learning so far and trying to get better at this game. As usual, you can find me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. All my stuff over on LateRound.com. Make sure that you go and you pre-order the draft guide, which you can find over on LateRound.com. But if you don't want to just pre-order it, you can always sign up over at Underdog, make a deposit, use promo code LateRound, and with that, you'll get a deposit offer and a free Late Round draft guide, which will hit your email inbox on July 1st when that thing drops. But on behalf of Hayden and myself, thanks for tuning in.